afternoon, good evening. My name is Tanya Frazier, and I am honored to be here as your moderator to begin today's virtual symposium. It is my honor and privilege to welcome you to the first ever International Association for Impact Assessment, or IAIA, virtual symposium and today's opening climate change keynote. On behalf of the team at IAIA, I thank you for your participation at this special event. I have a few housekeeping pieces that I'd like to cover as we get started before our keynote begins. First, a little information regarding how the control panel on the right hand of your screen works. There is a control panel there that provides you the ability to ask questions. Those questions can be asked, and Sarah, if you'd like to hit to the next slide, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. The slides have an option for you to ask questions, and that is a place throughout the chronology of the presentation. Feel free to ask questions at any juncture. We'll be collecting them. Sarah will be providing a Q&A section for the last chunk of the presentation time. So we will be able to proctor some of those questions aloud. If we don't get to your question, please know that we will be taking a look at putting some of those questions on the bulletin board as well. There is a chat area for you to be able to see messages coming from us. So if there's any links that we're needing to share or something like that, you can see them there, but there is no chat that you can provide to one another in this function. This session will be recorded and will be posted on the virtual symposium page, just like all of the other recordings following the session. And at that same location, you'll be able to find the slides from Sarah's presentation available for you in PDF form. And on to the next slide. So it is my honor and my privilege to welcome today's presenter, Sarah Cornell. Dr. Sarah Cornell is here to present to us an interconnected planet, taking a very large-scale, long-term, tightly linked impacts into account. Sarah, I'm going to turn the microphone and camera over to you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, and hello, everybody. This is my very first IAIA meeting, so thank you very much for this opportunity to discuss some familiar themes, but for me, a new context. Some of the ideas that I'll be discussing today are from our ERA research project, that's Earth Resilience in the Anthropocene. So before I go any further, I'll very gratefully acknowledge our funding from the European Research Council. Okay, to the topic of the symposium, the not unambitious idea of an interconnected planet. Now, I study this planet. I started my research career as an environmental chemist, and over time, I've been centrifuged into Earth system science on one hand, with its global and often very highly abstracted way of understanding the planet's biophysical dynamics. And then on the other hand, some very applied research on people's capacities to understand environmental change and to respond to them. So in other words, the things that interest me, both as a scholar and as someone who tries to apply the best of our knowledge for the goals of sustainability, the issues that interest me are the issues that involve thinking about both the human world and this biophysical Earth that we live in. And so in this context, the themes I want to raise today are all about rethinking what we mean by large-scale, long-term, tightly linked issues, especially the issues that we call global environmental change. So for me, large scale doesn't just mean geographically large or geopolitically large, like nations or biomes or continents. But I'm also interested in things that are systemically large. In other words, where there's many components with many connections. What counts as long-term kind of obviously depends on your perspectives, not just of the ticking of time, but also of the intensity of change processes. So for business planning, a year might be long-term. In the political domain, 5 years is like infinity in the sense that there's apparently nothing beyond a term of office. We have decadal plans for long-term infrastructure and for global sustainability policies. And Earth system scientists, the people who try to understand the interactions of climate with the living Earth, we piece together the evidence that decisions made on these kinds of timescales, of days to decades, have consequences that shape the biophysical Earth over centuries and millennia and even longer. When it comes to linked impacts, it's really easy to talk about links like a logical chain of causality. We often talk too about sort of falling dominoes of cascading or cumulative effects. But every environmental impact that we assess has social dimensions. And it's important to kind of hold in mind as well that every social decision has ecological dimensions. At the Stockholm Resilience Centre, it's part of Stockholm University, that's where I work, we use this sort of deliberately clumsy sounding term, the social-ecological system, with a hyphen linking social and ecological, as a way to flag that people are nature. Now, analytically and politically, it can be really useful, can be convenient to see these things as separate. But reality always ends up reminding us, sooner or later, that the social and the ecological are a complex tangle, where these social ecological links can kind of short circuit our mapped out causal chains. That's why we focus so much of our research on trying to understand resilience. I'm really pleased that that's a theme for later in this symposium. We use the term resilience to describe the many ways of dealing with change in an irreducibly complex world. So, my summary message, and like I say, these might also be useful as conclusions if you fall asleep already. Today's actions entail irreversible losses of Earth's living beings. They entail greater climate forcing than the world has seen for 3 million years. And we also see disruptive social ecological dynamics that really span the whole world. And obviously, this situation is precisely why the world needs impact assessments. But when problems have this kind of planet-scale magnitude, the levels of intervention become higher. So we're talking national or multilateral, and assessment becomes much, much more challenging. So in the rest of this session, I'm going to discuss these 3 aspects: irreversible change, unprecedented change, and then predictable surprises. The idea comes from Bazerman and the Harvard Business Review from about a decade or so ago. And I like the phrase, predictable surprises that too often play out as issues of social and environmental injustice. Now, these 3 issues are really big challenges for my own field of research. And in real-world decision-making, it often feels in some ways that they're so big that they end up too diffuse to act on. Irreversible change is treated as if it's no change at all in some ways, rather than it's a really profound, almost existential issue that we need to engage with. Anyway, we'll explore that a little bit later as well. But first, I'll briefly describe how our research at the interface of social ecological systems and Earth system science, how do we understand global environmental changes? This figure shows the Planetary Boundaries framework. The framework was devised about a decade ago, and it shows a set of critical environmental changes where human activities, particularly those of industrialized societies, are shifting the whole global system of the human world and the biophysical Earth. the European Environment Agency uses the term megatrends to describe these large-scale, long-term forces that have the power to transform the priorities and the trajectories of the world's societies. And the Planetary Boundaries framework flags 9 processes where human-caused perturbations are doing just that. Climate change is the poster child. It's now driven predominantly by human activity and the release of fossil fuel and greenhouse gases. We're in a situation now where managing climate impacts demands social transformations. But all of these issues, all these 9 issues, feature in a good environmental impact assessment: greenhouse gas emissions, ecological harms, resource use, pollution. And yet many of us, both outside the impact assessment community and people within it, seem to be feeling a growing concern that maybe we're hitting all the targets, but still somehow missing the mark when it comes to dealing with the scope and scale and the systemic interdependence of impacts. What was the rationale behind the Planetary Boundaries framework? Well, to some extent, it was first intended as a scientific research agenda. It was a call to action to climate scientists and to other people involved in global environmental research to do a much better job at integrating our observational data and our models, at integrating the science of past and present and possible futures, and above all, at integrating the science of global and local environmental changes. That integration effort is the everyday science of my day job. But at the same time, this Planetary Boundaries framework caught the attention of businesses, of policymakers, of city authorities, because it links this social with the ecological. It suggests that if we track and measure a linked set of biophysical changes, and if we can reduce the planetary pressures, then societies can perhaps deflect the risks and the impacts of environmental hazards that we expect will be intensifying into the future. I love this picture. The way that we understand the dynamics of the Earth system is really by piecing together the hard-earned knowledge of many contributory fields of study. This is a wiring diagram, and this wonderful diagram is called the Bretherton diagram because it comes from the Bretherton report for the Earth System Science Committee for NASA nearly 30 years, or more than 30 years ago. Ooh, time is flying. It's been an important basis for modeling and observing Earth's biophysical dynamics over the timeframes of decades to centuries. And it understands the Earth system as links between the ocean and the atmosphere and land. So in this rather complicated picture, every yellow box is a knowledge community. Like I say, oceans, atmosphere, land science. And every little white box is a measurement that needed to be made, like sea surface temperature or carbon and nitrogen fluxes, soil moisture, I'm staring at the screen, in order that we could have a predictive understanding of the Earth system. Now, the power of this diagram is that it set out the worldwide research strategy that enables the physical climate models that were first developed in the 1950s to kind of integrate more biogeochemical and ecological processes, and also the very fast dynamics of atmospheric chemistry. In fact, to integrate the processes that are increasingly being driven by human activities. So it's this science that lets us observe and detect and attribute the impacts of human activity at the very largest of scales. The physical climate system and the living biosphere are kind of the defining characteristics of the Earth system. Essentially, that's how geological epochs get defined. But human beings get a really special place in this diagram. Kind of we're half inside and half outside. Human activities are forcing the dynamics of the Earth system, and they're also entangled in the biophysical feedbacks through things like land use and pollution. We're in a situation where we, the peoples, are both impacting and impactees. And although this figure was made 30 years ago, to this day, this representation of our world with humans as a sort of semi-external forcing presents a really profound conceptual and operational research challenge. I might come back to this point later if I get a chance. So, it's a dynamic world, and we have a working understanding of its long-term biophysical dynamics. So let's look more closely at what irreversibility means in this global context. Now this wonderful diagram, you can see I collect quirky science visualizations. This is Leonard Eisenberg's Tree of Life. It actually shows all the major known branches of life tied to a geological timeline. It takes a little bit of explaining, so wait for it. Earth's birth, billions of years ago, is in the center of the timeline, and then time flows outwards to the present and the two sides. Deep in Earth history, we can see the evolution of the first bacteria and archaea, and then we get plants, and then over time, life exploits its surroundings. That's one of the defining characteristics of life. And biological diversity happens. This tree of life also shows some major branches that no longer exist. The big holes in the web of life are the mass extinctions that follow after things like immense mega eruptions or tectonic shifts or asteroid and meteor impact events. Now, obviously, extinction is forever. But on a living planet, different climate conditions create a push for life to diversify itself. The remaining life sort of fills in the empty niches. And studies show that this ecospace kind of rebuilds itself so that it can continue to respond to changes in climate. Ecologists hate this, but a lot of us try to understand Earth system change in terms of like the co-evolution of life and climate. But this process takes a very, very long time. From a human perspective, we might as well think of it as irreversible. Now, organisms construct the environments that they inhabit. So when you look at this current wave of human-caused extinctions, whether we're talking about the losses of the genetic library of life or of species or of entire habitats, this wave of extinctions means that some ecological niches will never reappear. Our future ecosystems are already consigned to be significantly different from the biosphere in which human beings evolved. I've been involved in the Worldwide Fund for Nature's Living Planet report for the last few cycles. They publish it every couple of years. The latest report came out just last month. And in my lifetime, wildlife populations have been slashed and burned and poisoned and harvested and hunted and bulldozed. And the Living Planet Index tracks these decades of decline in the populations. Now, kind of a really depressing observation, having been involved in these reports for 3 or 4 rounds now, is that these stories of some of the most severe environmental impacts seem to have no kind of social impact at all anymore. So, as it happens, environmental impact assessments also have roughly a 50-year history, at least in the sort of reasonably recognizable forms that we could implement today. This graph on the right is just a simple count of publications. Obviously, I'm not implying that correlation means anything in this inverse trend, but still, we're in a situation where the worse the environmental impact, the more environmental impact assessments and strategic environmental assessment publications we see. And obviously, the more we need as well. In the United Nations Environment Programme's recent global review, they point out really the obvious, kind of when that assessment regulations aren't applied consistently around the world. And we're in a situation where that social flexibility in regulation application is eroding our ecological resilience. It's creating fragility, if you want to think of it in those terms. I've got two more figures for you on global biodiversity. The one on the left is some work by Newbold and colleagues who made an assessment of biome intactness for the whole world. They used data from the World Conservation Monitoring Centre, and they filled out the monitoring gaps with predictive modelling based on other observational data and also on indicators of human disturbance. They showed that most biomes, that's kind of large-scale ecosystems, outside of the very high latitudes, fall short of the level that's indicated by the Planetary Boundaries framework. In other words, the Earth system functioning of these ecosystems has been changed. The diagram on the right, it's a cartoon, I know, but it kind of represents the various ways that biodiversity affects Earth system functioning. Biodiversity losses alter all these feedbacks between life and land and the water cycle and atmospheric chemistry and, of course, climate itself. Biosphere integrity is intrinsically dynamic. It's not static. And to be honest, we don't really understand that. We still count things and measure things and sort of reduce things to be able to understand the dynamics. But this intrinsic dynamic nature of life itself ultimately creates some really, let's say, difficult challenges, again, for both conceptualization and operationalization of ideas like the life cycle of products or, the kinds of things we might want to assess impacts of. It's also relevant to things like the mitigation hierarchy. When we think of the mitigation hierarchy that sort of prioritizes different levels of environmental protection, let's say, it's clear that even the most comprehensive ecosystem restoration and rehabilitation, fixing some of the problems that human activities have already created, even the most comprehensive rehabilitation can't fix or reflect this complexity. And yet we're in a situation where in a changing world and in a changing climate, it kind of has to. We really face a growing need to bring in this global perspective to local actions that reflect these, let's call them multi-temporal subglobal dynamics that link life and the physical world around us. Okay, to summarize this bit, the world is moving a very long way from the resilient biosphere conditions that made today's societies what they are. So rather than getting better and better at tracking our own macroecological decline, we really have to do better at respecting the livingness of the whole system. Because, and it shouldn't need to be said, the loss of livingness is very, very hard to reverse. Okay, let's move on to our next challenge area. This time we're going to take a very long look back at Earth's climate. As a global change scientist, I always get the question, but hasn't the climate always changed? And hasn't it been hotter before? And yeah. My colleagues often show this ice core record of past temperatures when they talk about the Anthropocene and the Planetary Boundaries framework, these ways of showing large-scale human disturbance of Earth system functioning. This figure shows the relative climatic stability of the Holocene epoch, the past 12,000 years or so, compared to the much more spiky and variable Ice Age conditions that came before it. And there's a really strong case, actually, that this stability, ecological and climatic stability, is what enabled all the things that we regard as the foundations of civilization to happen, with things like settlement and agriculture, long-distance trade. All of these things rely on reasonably predictable conditions. And of course, they're not totally predictable. You can see there's lots of squiggles and wiggles, even in the Holocene. But predictable enough on the timescales of, let's say, seasons to decades. You want to know that your crops will grow if you plant the seed. But let's look at this, another pretty picture, in its longer term context. This is Glenn Fergus's collation of Earth temperature data, and it combines lots of different studies and measures. The further we go back in time over to the left, the more approximate the information is, and it gets harder to sort of knit together the different kinds of data sources, whether it's ocean sediments or cave, I don't know, bits of rock that they analyze. You can tell I'm not a geologist, really. But even with this sort of rather bolted together time series, it's clear that the planet has indeed been much hotter and much more variable than it is now. The timeline on this graph is kind of telescoped, kind of each of the panels as we move from left to right zooms into more detail, partly because the available data are actually higher resolution the closer we come to the present. So we can see the onset about 1 million years ago of the kind of classic sawtooth pattern of ice ages and then the warmer interglacial periods. And we eventually come to our stable-looking Holocene here on the right-hand side. But when we talk about Earth resilience, we aren't really talking about stability. We're talking about the ways that we understand the biophysical and the biogeochemical feedbacks that control these overall dynamics. The coupling of climate and the carbon cycle is one example where we're trying to understand the feedbacks. And we've come to understand these feedbacks between climate and the biosphere and ice and land surfaces, largely through the study of the rate and the scale and the sequencing of these zigzags in the past. And here we are in 2020. We're changing the system's internal feedbacks by changing climate drivers and the biosphere and land and water and nutrient flows all at the same time. The world is essentially already committed to more than 1.5 degrees of global warming, unless new technologies that currently seem really quite fantastical get developed and used fast at scale. And the world's current social and economic pathways make 4 degrees of warming by the end of the century look increasingly likely. Now, I don't think people really understand what unprecedented global warming means, even now, even with decades of coordinated international scientific effort on global modeling, on Earth observation, large-scale experiments, the kinds of things that led to graphs like this. And even with the sort of international science policy processes that translate our science into options for mitigation action. So somehow when we're talking about things like 2050 or 2100, they also seem like fantastical dates somehow far off into the future. Now, a decade or so ago, I worked in a research program with the UK's climate impact scientists at the UK Met Office. Now, to some extent, impacts of climate can be predicted, at least in that scientific sense of kind of if-then projections, of testing hypotheses about what the future might hold. We're not talking about prophesying the future. Anyway, this diagram is quite literally a heat map showing the kinds of impacts that might be expected on a planet that is 4 degrees hotter. You can see, okay, again, it's a rather cartoony figure. You can see that the impact circles kind of stack up on each other. It's no surprise to anyone that the hotter the world gets, the more intense and geographically widespread and actually systemically wide-ranging the impacts are going to be. But I want to challenge this idea that unprecedented climate changes have unprecedented impacts. Climate-related environmental disasters are intensifying now. We don't need to wait to 2050. The impacts of environmental disasters, climate-related disasters, are often tracked with very, very great detail. I just pulled these statistics off the UN's OCHA website, Relief Web, today. And, we count the number of pregnant women and under 5-year-olds sleeping under mosquito nets. Now, obviously, this kind of detailed tracking is vitally important if we're going to be preventing environmental crisis from also becoming even more of a health crisis. But to wrap this issue up, it's becoming clearer every year that passes that people's everyday activities are pushing the global climate system far away from its long-term Holocene baseline. If we're going to manage impacts so that they don't become serious interconnected risks, well, that's going to take really unprecedented climate mitigation efforts, not just for this decade, but for the foreseeable future, and I think, in a sense, for the unforeseeable future too. And that leads me to my final challenge area. This is the idea of the predictable surprise. We should be expecting surprises in a socially, ecologically interconnected planet. And these issues are almost always going to be playing out as issues of unfairness and inequity. I've mentioned land quite a bit here. Habitat changes are one of the biggest drivers of both biodiversity loss and climate change. So that's part of the reason we're climate scientists are interested in life in ways that are both really important, but that weren't the case maybe 30 years ago. So a lot of impact assessment relates to land planning decisions as well. I've already explained a little bit how a systems view links Earth's climate and the living world. Changing land cover changes the workings of this system, as this rather complicated feedback figure shows. The very first dynamic vegetation models were developed about 20 years ago. It's better to think of them as land ecosystem water cycle biochemistry models because they capture many of these feedbacks on timeframes of days to seasons to many decades. When these when these computer models, the dynamic vegetation models, are coupled with climate models, it becomes possible to see how biomes respond to climate changes. In these visualizations of model output, blue means surface runoff intensifies. I mean, we'd probably describe that as flooding in large parts of the world, but it isn't quite the same. Red means that conditions dry out. And in the top left-hand panel, where we've got heating of 2 degrees or less, you see that the kind of changes to runoff are global, but comparatively moderate. As temperature ramps up to beyond 2 degrees or beyond 3 degrees, the drying out or the wettening tends to intensify. And the feedbacks with vegetation mean that it's not such a simple picture as just saying dry places get drier, wet ones get wetter. I mean, yes, that tends to be the broad brush picture, but it will not be safe for decision makers and impact assessors to just stick to that kind of rule of thumb. As our models and observations and data assimilation techniques all improve, it's becoming possible to characterize more complex outcomes and the non-linear behavior of the system. And some of this characterization is going to involve some irreducible uncertainties, where gathering more data and adding more boxes and arrows to the wiring diagrams of our global models is not actually going to enable the holy grail of pinpoint precision when we're wanting to predict climate impacts. But having said that, some new techniques and new ways of thinking systemically are pointing to some new challenges as well. Work by Keyes and colleagues is making us rethink transboundary effects in the context of the water cycle. Land use changes have consequences for moisture recycling. The kind of, obviously we know that water evaporates and it gets carried along and falls down as rain. And that process plays out in kind of cells over the continents. These atmospheric rivers have watersheds too, and Patrick Keyes calls them precipitation sheds. Reanalysis data shows that these precipitation sheds are kind of semi-permanent features in the atmosphere. So we can use Earth observation techniques to cast a very new light on what vulnerable areas might be. Land use change in one place by one country will change the water flows to another place, which in turn changes the vegetation that is possible there and the water flows to somewhere else. The implication of this kind of work is that it's not going to be enough to look at the impacts of just, let's say, wet water extraction, like from rivers and lakes. If land uses like deforestation also change the green water cycling that carries water across continental scales, countries will be able to point to the causes of drought, not just loosely and diffusely as all of climate, but perhaps pointing to the places where one country's land use choices have caused this cascading effect. This is an example of a kind of a biophysical mechanism behind what a lot of people are beginning to call social-ecological telecoupling, this sort of connection of impacts across space and across time. So, actually, Keyes and his colleagues, this is a sidetrack a little bit, they've been exploring what these shifting precipitation sheds mean for the world's megacities. And I find that work really interesting because it sort of starts to link producers and consumers and rural and urban environments. And above all, the linking of land and atmosphere and water governance in ways that I think are really challenging. So, as I start to wrap up, I want to just raise a couple of ideas that might trigger discussion. So far, I've been emphasizing the long-term, large-scale and interconnected aspects of global change as reasons for urgent action to reduce the environmental impacts of social activities. In this kind of context, it's really easy to talk about environmental crisis. Excuse me a minute. People have observed that one of the earliest uses of the concept of crisis came from the field of medicine. Crisis imposes these choices between really stark alternatives like life or death, right or wrong action. It even carries through to ideas of religion and law, salvation or damnation as well. We can think of crisis as the moment that the scales tip one way or the other. Eric Palya, a few years ago in his doctoral work, flagged the other ancient medical term, crisis and lysis, as sort of pairs of describing issues of health. Lysis is an ongoing, chronic, and ultimately terminal process of crumbling apart. When I heard this distinction, I just went, ooh. It makes me rethink environmental crisis. It can be really useful to distinguish lysis, this kind of progressive disintegration of the basis of life, from the crises that we create by specific circumstances. This distinction might have a bearing, for instance, on how we choose to depreciate life cycle impacts over time. Crisis language often speaks really loudly to those people who want to take strong action and implement solutions to tip the scales and to steer the system. The sociologist Martin Heyer, who was the former director of the Netherlands Environment Assessment Agency, he responded to the Planetary Boundaries framework with this line. There's nobody in the cockpit of planet Earth. Cockpitism is the illusion that top-down governance is going to work for complex social ecological challenges. Now, I tend to share Heyer's view, and at the same time, I hope I've been showing that the scientific processes of kind of top-down Earth system science Earth system analysis, the breaking down of a complex system into partially understandable, admittedly simplified, bite-sized chunks. This tells us something really important about society's impacts. And I think these insights need to be brought even further into everyday decision processes at all the various levels of real-world practical governance. For me, I think sustainability means noticing this lysis, not just trying to prevent crisis. But in the absence of top-down governance, what can we do as scientists? How can the insights of our top-down analysis flow better into today's dynamic and energetic decision-making? For many of us, this transdisciplinary integration challenge brings a lot of issues of ethics and justice and scientific responsibility. It brings it to the foreground. When our starting point is the analysis and quantification of biophysical conditions, then obviously quantitative metrics and indicators become our everyday currency. And equally obviously, we have to be putting our best scientific understanding into practice, showing how these global biophysical impacts become risks, with an ever higher likelihood of becoming crisis as well. But at the same time, people and our complex networks of trade and information flows and political relationships, we mess up a perfectly good physical system. And it's in this context of sort of socio-economic interconnectedness that predictable surprises become the norm. And then, when the decisions of the powerful and of the economically well-endowed have consequences that affect people and living nature far away and very, very far into the future, then that's where I argue that we need to really equip ourselves fast with a new vocabulary and new implementation toolkits that help us to deal better with precaution, preparedness, and if there's any justice in this world, with empowerment as well. So my closing thought draws on discussions on a very recent paper by biodiversity colleagues. In the biodiversity world, there's a very active discussion right now about global target setting. Do we need an apex target for biodiversity? And it's a topical issue, and the discussions are really quite intense. We often hear the line, what gets measured gets managed. But I think I've shown you that that isn't necessarily true. It often slips too easily into the view that if we're doing the measuring, then somehow we are managing. So the thought I want to leave you with really is that if we want to avoid a creeping but very well meticulously measured decline, we really need to hold on to the idea that climate change is ecosystem change. Biodiversity losses, natural resource use and pollution, they are climate change too, in the sense of intensifying this lysis, reducing the large-scale and long-term resilience. And all these biophysical changes are inextricably social changes too. So our challenge, should we choose to accept it, is to reconnect and reconfigure social-ecological relationships across space and across time. So now, I'm looking forward to the discussions. Thank you, Chair.
Wonderful. Way to go, Sarah. What a wonderful presentation. I would love to invite folks to put questions into the question panel. And while we do, Sarah, I'm going to send you an invitation to turn your webcam on, because for some reason, it does not have your webcam turned on without your overt permission. So I just sent you an invite, if you would be so kind, so we can see your beautiful face. Wonderful.
Hello.
Great. She's
I'm
here.
just going to move it so that I'm looking kind of forward. There we go.
There you go. You look great. So we are at a place now to be able to take any questions that folks have. None have come in thus far, Ms. Sarah, so we're just going to give folks a minute to enter questions, ponderances, things they'd like to raise to our speaker. And maybe in the meantime, while they do, Sarah, I'll pose a question to you. If you had in a room with you the powers that be, as you spoke of the importance of governance, really thinking about this from a different perspective, what pieces of advice would you give them in so far as major changes that need to happen to address where we are headed?
I think one of the most frustrating things as a global change scientist is a sense that the world knows what needs to be done. I mean, we've got, agreements that set out so clearly what kinds of actions are needed. Commitments were made in 1992 for avoiding the worst of dangerous climate change and for halting the loss of biodiversity. We've got policies, we've got agreements. The big challenge is just the implementation. And I think that that's why I've been so interested in this idea that so much of our monitoring and measurement seems to be really, I hate to use the phrase, tracking our own decline. That's what I was thinking about, especially in the biodiversity context. We know quite a lot about what, in practical terms, what also needs to be done. So, yeah, I really kind of would want to get, yeah, I've got to be careful what I say here. One of the problems, I think, is that the powers that be are the powers that are. And it means that the other powers in the world, the kind of the coexisting economies and the coexisting many different kinds of actors, have a harder time to actually get their voices heard. I think this is one of the most interesting things about impact assessment, is that very often there's a very detailed assessment of what is actually happening on the ground. But when it comes to the final push and shove of decision making, things get sort of watered down or sidelined. This idea that the bigger our global environmental problems become, the higher the levels of governance that we're going to have to invoke to be able to make action is kind of true. And at the same time, we also need to hold on to the very local decision making that keeps the connection to the local impacts, the impactees. Does that make sense?
It does to me. I think it sounds wonderful. And thank you for letting me kind of shift into that question. Here's a question for you from Weston Fisher. How do we overcome powerful memes of disinformation associated with both profit motives and politics?
Oh, Lord, if I knew that, I'd be... I think this is, obviously, I work in a university, and I kind of feel that as long as I get a lot of comfort from the fact that societies, for as long as we've had societies, have set some people aside in places of learning to keep embodying critical perspectives on the world. That also tells me that, we've always had disinformation and power handling for as long as societies have been societies. But I think that we recognize how important it is to build the habits of critical interrogation and again of monitoring, measurement, looking at things from more than one perspective at the same time. So yeah, I think there's not really any substitute for the slow, meticulous process of trying and trying and trying again to make people hear and think and listen and look. Depressing
Great.
as well.
Depressing and yet true. Wonderful. We have a question from Claudia Valencia Franque. who says, great presentation, Sarah, thank you. My question for you is, what would your advice be for impact assessment practitioners? How can we address or integrate the ideas you mentioned in our practice? Have you seen any good practices that you can share with us?
That's part of the reason I wanted to be part of this discussion, actually. I'm interested to see how we can make some of our rather, really cool technologies and measure and science be more relevant to some of these processes. There are some really interesting discussions at the moment on things like life cycle impact assessment, trying to sort of recognize the global baseline or the trying to sort of bring more absolute perspectives rather than this sort of relative, the tracking of change over time. I think we've also really already understood the important, the kind of the safeguards on an overly techno, data rich, biophysical way of understanding the world. By things like bringing in the participatory processes and bringing in multiple perspectives again. So I think, for instance, if we're looking at climate impacts, it is important to bring in ecological perspectives too. If we've got one quantifying global top-down understanding of the world, having a qualitative bottom-up understanding helps to do the truth check that we were just talking about. That's true for science and also for some of the social aspects. But yeah, I'm very interested to see, to get more practical ways of how we can translate some of our research into more applicable ways.
Fantastic, thank you. Another question. If management shouldn't be based on metrics, what do you recommend as new pillars for the new management frameworks?
Management should be based on metrics, but not only on metrics. And again, I think, actually, here I'm going to go off on a sidetrack as well. In academia, we've started getting quality metrics. And of course, the very first thing when you specify metrics is somebody will game the system. And in a way, that's kind of true for any complex system. That when you put a structure there, any adaptive system will try to work its way around the system. So, and again, I think if you know that your system is not just dynamic in the sense of kind of swinging between two really well characterized states, but really co-evolving, a transforming state, then you won't be wanting your metrics to sort of count the staticness of the system. You need metrics that capture some more of the dynamics. Now, and if you don't have those metrics, then I think that throws us back at the question of precaution. How can we work with the situation where our ignorance, I know that's not the definition of precaution, but the situation where our ignorance actually is playing into part of the risk as well. We kind of need to use the full toolkit, not just the bingo card approach. I think another rather, the whole world seems to be against regulation, but I think the questions of standardization and regulation, in other words, a kind of preventing side of things, is also really important. But again, yes. I really welcome more questions back on that.
It is an ongoing conversation, that's for sure. Here's another question for you. When it comes to resilience, is it surviving by having so many attributes that one does not have to change, or is it surviving by changing?
The wonderful thing about the word resilience is that it seems to be stretching to cover more and more stuff. I mean, kind of when it first came out in the sort of 1970s to describe ecosystems, the big question was, why do ecosystems stay recognizably the same when everything around them changes? How do they cope with change? And the insights that have given us that sort of come from understanding what makes a system cope with change tend also to be useful. insights in informing how systems might be able to change themselves and change the systems that they're part of. Now, here I'm describing the world as if it were systems, kind of, and the tendency when we talk about that is to sort of think of blobs and lines connecting them. And so it is useful to sort of remember the really profound complexity. We both are and are not systems at the same time. So I think that resilience is increasingly being used in the kind of the pull to try to understand how to change when we see the risks coming right at us. I'm really glad that resilience is a theme for later in the symposium. I think that the more we can find common ground under these sort of umbrella terms, but again, really understanding and unpicking what they mean for particular contexts is going to be important.
Great. And time for one last question. And then, Sarah, I invite you, after you're complete with your answer of this question, then feel free to provide any closing remarks that you'd like, okay? So the last question is, you had said that there is not a cockpit in which we can make change. Does that not discount the effect that impact assessment or any other planning tools provide?
I have often discussed this with Martin Heyer, and I tend to think that, yes, there's not one person in this cockpit. It's much more that we've kind of got loads of people hitting all the buttons at the same time. For me, that's a more powerful metaphor. But certainly, that doesn't mean that I think it is very difficult to steer the system, because for every action that we implement, there will be these shadow consequences. So a climate impact, an effort to mitigate climate, for instance, can play out in so many different ways for ecosystems around them. So if we move to biofuels, then obviously we're using land, we're using fertilizers, we're using water resources in ways that will also have consequences. So kind of thinking about the sort of not just the impact that we're looking at, but this sort of complicated, messy onion of interdependent other impacts, shadow impacts, I think means that we enter into this cockpit with more humility, and again, requiring much more responsive and sensitive data and information, or else much more slow and deliberative processes. You kind of need to sort of get that balance. That's only half an answer, but that's it for the time.
Fantastic. Any closing statements you'd like to make, ma'am?
One is just thank you for these fantastic questions. There've been this whole discussion from the invitation until right now has been really thought-provoking for me. And again, it's sort of shown me that even though I tend to think I understand impacts from a very large perspective, a global perspective, and I work with people who do impact assessment of different kinds, this is we have very different knowledge communities out there working with the same kind of objective. And so the more that we can hang out in each other's symposiums, and I fully intend to be part of the bulletin board discussions later, then I think the more equipped we are to deal with this sort of context of rapidly changing environmental conditions that we face right now. So thank you, everybody.
Okay, and I will second that. Thank you to everyone who has attended. Thank you to those of you who are watching the recording of this presentation. And I invite you to head on over to the bulletin board to continue the conversation, as well as to check out the additional presentations that are available on the topic of climate change today and for the next 3 days of content to come. So thank you so much for being here, and have a great rest of your day.